Welcome back. This is part 2 of the Caputo sessions from here in the cubicle, and we're going to move on and talk about the insistence of God, Jack's second major theological work. Before we do that, just briefly, I want to encourage you to check out part 2 of The Weakness of God, especially the stuff on sacred anarchy. It's really cool. Jack talks about the kingdom of God. It develops a poetics of the impossible. Poetics is sort of the language of radical theology, and he does it in a pretty breathtaking kind of a way. So check out part 2, Sacred Anarchy in the Weakness of God, if you get an opportunity to. And we'll now talk about the insistence of God, which is Jack's most recent contribution to the field of radical theology. The basic idea is reasonably simple. God does not exist. God only insists. So again, God is not a being out there somewhere that exists in the great beyond or whatever. God is the name of an event that insists. And what insists in the name of God? This event is what Jack refers to as a call, or a invitation, or an address, a solicitation, or a provocation. So the insistence of God is the insistence of a call that disturbs, haunts, or unhinges us and calls us for a response. So again, when Caputo says that God does not exist but only insists, he simply means that the insistence of God is a call or provocation that disturbs those of us who exist, as well as haunting the public expressions of institutional religion. Another way of thinking of the insistence of God, or thinking about the insistence of God, is as an unanswerable question or problem or task or challenge. It's something that exceeds our calculations, exceeds our rules and programs and so forth. So what's going on in the name of God is an insistent call that calls for a response or an invitation to a certain form of life. And it's up to us who exist to actualize this way of life through our own embodied response to the insistent call of God. In this way, there is what Caputo calls a chiasmic intertwining, a chiasm between God who insists and we who exist. Simply put, the basic idea here is stop insisting that God exists and start existing because God insists. Now, this is it's also important here to understand that the insistence of God is an unheard call. We do not know who or what calls us. And this is an important sort of confession in many ways, because not knowing who it is that calls, the unheard call is what constitutes it. The fact that it is unheard is what constitutes it. So to explain this, I guess as soon as we do know who or what it is that calls or addresses us, as soon as that happens, we have already begun to master the call, to make it our own, and we're no longer the subject of an address. We are no longer being put into question. We are no longer being put on the spot and being made responsible. It's already on our own terms. It's kind of knowing who it is that calls us, knowing who or what it is that calls us is, in that sense, a kind of idolatry in a way. So the insistence of God is an unheard call. We do not know who or what addresses us in the name of God, and that's what constitutes it as an insistent call. Now, this is further fleshed out in what Caputo calls a theopoetics, or a poetics of the perhaps. or simply God, perhaps. In a way, we never really know for sure, again, whether our response to this unheard call is going to turn out for the best or be a disaster. There's no guarantee in advance. And for that's why Caputo formulates this in terms of a poetics of God, perhaps. Of course, perhaps is usually the last thing we'd want to expect our theologians to say about the name of God. But this is not an agnosticism, it's of a very different order or register. It's neither a vague or evasive admission that we just don't know either. It's to do with our lived experience, and it's an intensification of our lived experience, this poetics of perhaps. The primary sort of or general thrust of Caputo's theological and philosophical writings is to keep ourselves very close to what shows up in our lived experience of life. And in this sense, the poetics of God perhaps is it reminds us that what's given to us in life, in our experience, is the ambiguity or the undecidability in things. And he calls this the promise/risk. So his poetics of the perhaps is a promise, simultaneously a promise and a risk in terms of our response to the event. It's where our standard oppositions sort of are unsettled and destabilised. Not simply promise and a risk, but also theism and atheism, or faith and doubt. We can't reduce one of these to the other, because our actual experience of life is marked by this undecidability, this sort of this deep ambiguity in things. That's why we are haunted. That's why we are caught up in these unanswerable questions. So the promise-risk of this poetics of the perhaps is both an invitation and a challenge. And this poetics of perhaps is of a very different order and register, because it spooks, it haunts, it disturbs and unsettles metaphysics, or also theology, or anything that depends on simple black and white distinctions. Anything that sort of pretends to know exactly what's what is haunted by this sort of poetics of perhaps. So it sort of means infinite trouble in a way. This doesn't bring assurance and peace. God perhaps brings trouble because we are to abandon the shield of safety that's provided by classical theology, and again risk exposure to the event that haunts theology as this kind of spooky insistence that's both a promise and a threat. So don't confuse this poetics of perhaps with the standard logic of propositional truth that sort of wants to know what's true and false and wants to be objective and certain about what's going on and so forth. It's a different kind of register of things. This is not, the poetics of perhaps is not something we propose, it's something that we are exposed to. And so, again, what's going on in the name of God is not so much a human projection, but a projectile that's directed straight towards our heads. So, the perhaps, the poetics of this promise, risk, this exposes us to the contingency of life, the difficulty of life. It opens us up to the best, but it also opens us up to the possibility of the worst. So what we're left with is a rather unnerving relationship to the open-endedness of the future, where the future comes to us as something we do not see coming. So again, we're affirming here the ambiguity and the undecidability of the event that is contained in the name of God. So in many ways, this is a dangerous, perhaps. It has teeth. It's got a bit of an edge to it, because again, it never settles into a stable structure of meaning that can be secured by any metaphysics or any strong theology of God or being or substance or necessity or anything along those lines. It's the promised risk of the event is a poetics of the insistence of God. And it means that we are to sustain the uncertainty of life. We're to maintain this open-endedness towards the future as a venture into the unknown. Where any attempt to protect ourselves or draw back from or inoculate ourselves from the ambiguity and the precariousness and the contingency of life will only prevent the event. So again, this poetics of the perhaps is a way of keeping the future for God open. It's a way of actually releasing the event that's harboured in the name of God. It's a way of keeping ourselves very, honest to God, or very close to the real experience of life as it is, in terms of our the uncertainty and the ambiguity in things. In this sense, the poetics of God perhaps is something we need to have the heart for, the courage to cope with and expose ourselves to. For the event that's released in the name of God, in and through this poetic of perhaps, in and through this God perhaps, the event that's released here is something that overtakes us, overturns us, uproots and unhinges us. Kind of makes us reconfigure our sense of reality and what's possible and what's impossible and so forth. It's where we lose our grip and find ourselves in the grip of something that sort of carries us along. This is where we're exposed and vulnerable and aghast with expectation. And it's this insistent call that Caputo describes as in poetics of the promised risk. It calls us to undergo fundamental transformation, to reinvent ourselves, to let ourselves be reinvented through what he calls the possibility of the impossible. So this is just a way of stripping away the false certitudes of confessional theology and releasing the event, the possibility of the impossible, releasing the chance of being transformed and reconfiguring how we live and so forth. So that's why this is quite radical, and it's quite this poetics of perhaps is quite relentless. It cuts through so deep. We really do need to acknowledge, the depth with which this poetics of perhaps goes to in many ways. Faith means you are not safe. So this can be looked at also here in terms of what Caputo calls religion without religion, or a/theism. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about those two elements here, which is sort of, how are we going to make sense of the work that's been done here by the likes of Caputo in terms of its application to embodied communal forms of life. Religion without religion is, in many ways, again, it's not a simple without. There's a slash between the with and the out here. Religion without religion is religion with religion and religion without religion. Now, of course, let me unpack this a little bit, because it's basically, in simple terms, it means faith without belief, or faith with and without belief. So our particular beliefs are more local, more stabilised, more codified, and so forth. But there's an underlying faith here that we see in the work of Derrida that's developed by Caputo. There's an underlying faith and hope in life that's more restless and open-ended, more disturbing and unpredictable, more destabilised, less confinable. So while beliefs sort of demand a sort of determinate assent, beliefs demand an assent or let me say that again. Religious belief usually demands our assent to a belief system, a certain creed, a certain set of doctrines, and so forth. Here we're talking about this sort of a structure of religion with Caputo, Derrida, and so forth, that's more an unconditional, a more unconditional faith that is without dogma, without sort of the content of a identifiable Messiah or certain creeds and confessions. This unconditional faith, it doesn't depend on any of this sort of stuff. It's a structural feature of the human heart. Again, it's very close to our lived experience of being human. And it involves things like this an openness to the unforeseeable future, or the possibility of the impossible, or hoping against hope. And that's regardless of the different subjective beliefs that sort of might shape it from any particular religion and so forth. So this is a form of faith here. When we're talking about religion without religion, it's faith without belief. It's a form of faith in the coming of something that we can't quite make out. And in many ways, what makes it faith is that we are groping in the dark here. So this distinction between faith and belief, as we're using it in this context, it's made in order to highlight this, to highlight this notion that we are stumbling in the dark, seeking something we know not what, something we cannot really master or control or confine in many ways. So it's precisely this deeper sense of unknowing that makes this truly faith and not knowledge or certainty. And again, so this is also this not knowing, this sense of groping in the dark, the sense of being open to something we cannot see coming. It points again to the undecidability and the ambiguity of our lived experience, and especially when it comes to these events that overtake and outstrip us and interrupt us. These events show up at the very limits of experience, and they disorientate our basic meaning-making structures, our basic way of understanding exactly what's what and so forth. Only in and so, but it's only because these events have this undecidability about them. That undecidability is precisely what makes real decisions and real passions and commitments in life genuine in many ways, because call us to make fundamental commitments and decisions in life without certainty, without assurance, without the guardrails or the security of knowing that it's going to work out for the best, or that we're on the way to the promised land, or we know exactly that who or what God is and so forth involved. And so we've got the riskiness of life here, the difficulty of life comes into the fore through this unconditional structure of faith that Caputo sees going on in religion, without all the beliefs and the creeds and so forth. Now, it's important to realise that, again, this is not simply religion without religion in the sense of faith without any belief. It's more ambiguous than that, more undecidable than that. The structure of faith here is neither wholly with nor wholly without determinate beliefs. So it's really faith with belief and faith without beliefs. Again, it's both. There's a sense of we live both with and without the particular beliefs of our faith, tradition, and so forth. Same goes for the distinction between theism and atheism. And this is what we mean by a/theism. What we mean is we live both with and without theism, and we live both with and without atheism. So we're neither fully with nor fully without any of these posited beliefs, either the beliefs of any religious tradition, or when it comes to the positive belief in either theism or atheism, neither fully with, neither fully without. So it's in that sense there is this is a sense of how we are exposed to the restless provocation in things, and the lack of any kind of stable, secure grounding for our fundamental commitments and so forth. So when it comes to this a/theism, atheism, or religion with/out religion, it doesn't so much concern the beliefs in our heads, and it really is more to do with the desire in our hearts, a desire beyond desire, hoping against hope. I guess we can put it this way: a person can change their beliefs. They change their mind about something. They're not true anymore. They have their doubts and they adopt a new position. And their life goes on. Nothing much really changes. Doesn't make a huge difference. But if you lose your faith, in the sense that the word is used by Caputo, everything's lost. If you've lost your faith in life, you've lost hope in the future. You've lost heart and you can't go on. So that's a way of coming to grips with this faith without belief. It's in a more unconditional structure of our experience in many ways. So radical theology is about reinventing our inherited texts and traditions, releasing the future that they harbour, and it's not safe or reassuring. It doesn't give us an explanation for everything, but it is a life-giving force, and it forces us to reinvent what we have inherited, to give it a future. So this is how our deconstruction can keep the future open. Right. I think we can probably talk a little bit now about one way in which we can begin to see how this might show up in a communal context, in embodied communal life as an alternative faith community. I reckon it really comes down to this sense of the destabilisation of any position or identity. I think that's where you find common ground amongst most of these radical theologians. Because once we begin to doubt our most cherished beliefs, we can't really say I am anymore. You can't say I am an atheist as a position. You can't say I'm a theist as a position, or I'm a materialist as a position. I mean, once you expose them to doubt, to say that I am this thing and I'm not anything else, it's kind of obscene and ridiculous at this point. And this brings us to what Caputo calls the secret, which involves not knowing who we are. In other words, the secret is there is no secret. The secret is we do not know who we are, we do not know where we've come from, and we don't really know why we're here, not in any deep or profound way. And not knowing the secret of who we are is the key to everything here. So just let me unpack this a little bit. It's not knowing the answer. It's not knowing what's what. It's not knowing who it is or what it is that calls us. This is what marks our capacity to be otherwise and to reinvent ourselves. So we are all inhabited by an abyss. This abyss that's what we are, and this means the failure of any identity to be ultimately identical with itself. Now, this failure is what constitutes identity, is what makes us who we are. And this means that there's a radical form of freedom from all forms of identity. Again, theist, atheist, religious, secular, liberal, conservative. We never are what we are. And therefore something different is always possible. Put it this way, it's in the very process of wrestling with unanswerable questions. It's the very process of wrestling with the question of who I am, for instance, that we forge a sense of self. This is precisely how we stir up and intensify and constitute an identity. So, because identity is never identical with itself, we are to keep the questions alive. There's a perpetual questioning and wrestling here, and we are to do so precisely because that is what an identity or a self is. Who are we? We are the ones who do not know who we are. I think it's very similar to what Augustine said in the Confessions, I have become a question to myself. And now we lack this knowledge of who we are, not merely as a limitation or as a sign of our ignorance that might one day be overcome. That's not it. We are constituted by this lack of identity with ourselves. And we are never more true to ourselves than when we confess that we lack the truth of who we are. We are never more true to ourselves than when we say, I do not know who I am. I do not know the truth of who I am or what I desire. We'll talk about this with the work of Zizek a bit later on. But Zizek says that the identities and the roles that inscribe us into social life, just briefly, under the big other which secures the social order and so forth, or the status quo, these identities and roles function as a fundamental fantasy that allow us to avoid the traumatic void that signals the groundlessness of our true freedom. There's a groundlessness there in this abyss that allows us to choose who we want to be without any of the conditions or pre-given assumptions of the status quo and so forth. So that there is this void at the core of our being, an abyss, on account of which we never get to know who or what we are. Now, what we usually call subjectivity, positive subjectivity, ultimately then conceals this terrifying abyss. But this abyss is also our radical freedom for self-determination. For when there is no big other to provide the ultimate guarantee, or the ontological cover for our decisions in life, then something else is possible. Another kind of decisive act is possible by which we can choose who we are in a truly human way. So again, this is not merely a statement about, we don't know who we are, we can't know who we are, but there's some big other or some God or some subject supposed to know who knows the secret of our hearts. That's not it. It's more like precisely in opening up this gap, this division, this abyss of subjectivity, we realise that we are nothing but this failure to know who we are. As Zizek puts it, the subject is nothing but the failure of subjectification. So this is where you find common ground between the likes of Caputo and Zizek, I believe. I'm going to talk a bit more about this in the next session. But there's a theory of subjectivity here. Again, it might look like a limitation on our capacity to grasp, self, world and reality and so forth, but it's not. We are nothing but this abyss of non-identity. Identity, who we are, is the failure of identity, again. And for Caputo, this means that it's just not possible to have consolidated oneself entirely on either side of the theistic or atheistic divide. To be either religious or irreligious is impossible. Or to do so without doubt is impossible anyway. And so this is where we undermine the metaphysics of presence and identity. This is where we undermine the big categories that we use to secure a sense of self and a sense of meaning in life. So this is where we get religion without religion and A/theism, in this sense of the negativity of our subjectivity as a kind of a void of non-identity. A/theism, in this sense, it might look like garden variety atheism to your standard theistic believer, true believer. It also might look like theism to your standard atheist, to people who rightly pass for atheists. But it's neither. It's neither atheism nor theism. It's neither with atheism or without atheism. And it's neither with theism or without theism. So again, we're talking about this inability to secure, through our standard distinctions, one way or the other, what's what. It's the undecidability here that makes a real decision possible. It makes fundamental commitments and responsibilities possible. Because the choices are our own. They're not being made for us by these various structures that we've inherited. So what we've got here is an affirmation of a deeper faith in a core that cuts across our conventional distinctions that are between atheism and theism, faith and doubt, belief and unbelief and so forth. There is an address going on in both these and all our other determinate confessions of faith. But the negativity of subjectivity, this void of non-identity, means that it's not only impossible to assert a theistic or atheistic identity in the manner that avoids the void that we are, it also means that there is perhaps a certain way of life here. When it comes to living with the undecidability between theism and atheism, there's a certain form of life perhaps, a mode of association that may well be productive and generative and may well be a very positive way of forging new kinds of communities. So we'll talk a bit more about that next time. I just wanted to finish up with that. Hopefully it's made some sense, but we are more than happy to unpack that. It makes a lot more sense in the light of the work of Slavoj Zizek. But I'll stop there. Hopefully I haven't gone over time, and we'll see you again shortly. Thanks.